At my daughter's wedding, before 200 witnesses dressed in silk, satin, and tailored suits, I was humiliated in a way no parent should ever endure. My son's son-in-law, Adrian Clark, demanded the key to my apartment as if I were a servant, not the mother of the bride. When I refused, his hand struck me across the face so hard the sound echoed through the ballroom. Gasps filled the air. My cheek burned, but what stung worse was the silence of my own son, Daniel, who stood by frozen, watching his mother being slapped, yet saying nothing. That was the moment I knew. They had chosen greed over blood, and it was time I chose revenge. The hall smelled of roses and champagne. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light over the crowd. Waiters glided between tables, pouring wine, serving slices of prime rib, and refilling champagne flutes. Guests clinked glasses, their laughter rolling like music across the high ceilings of the downtown Chicago ballroom. For most mothers, this would have been a moment of pride. Their daughter, Margaret Lawson's only daughter, was radiant, dressed in a lace gown that caught every sparkle of the light. Margaret had worked tirelessly, quietly, and faithfully to ensure this day happened without flaw. She had even written checks behind the scenes when Daniel fell short on payments. But Margaret knew something the crowd did not. Her son-in-law, Adrian, had been circling her for months like a hawk circling prey. He smiled too much, asked too many questions about her finances, and expressed too much concern about her living alone. His interest was never about her well-being. It was about what she had, or what he thought she had. That evening, in front of everyone, his mask fell. Adrian stood from the head table, clinking his glass to gather attention. Guests turned their heads. His tall frame and slicked-back hair gave him an air of authority he didn't deserve. He held the microphone like a man claiming ownership of the room. "I'd like to take this moment," he began, voice dripping with a false warmth, "to talk about family, about trust, about how we must care for those who once cared for us." The audience nodded, polite, unaware of what was coming. He turned suddenly, eyes narrowing on Margaret. "But what is family," he continued, "if not about sharing what we have? My dear mother-in-law here has been living alone in a tiny apartment far too long. At her age, is that safe? Is it responsible?" Margaret stiffened. Whispers stirred among the guests. Adrian stepped down from the table, walking toward her. "The truth is," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound intimate yet loud enough for all to hear, "she no longer needs that place. And today, in front of all of you, I ask, no, I demand, she hand over her apartment keys. For the good of the family." The ballroom fell silent. Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she held her ground. Her apartment wasn't much compared to her hidden empire, but it was hers. Her sanctuary. "No," she said firmly. Adrian's smile cracked. For a brief second, his face revealed what lurked beneath, the rage, the entitlement. Then, in one swift motion, he raised his hand and struck her across the cheek. The sound slapped the air. Gasps burst from every corner of the room. A woman at the next table screamed. Margaret staggered back, pressing a hand to her face. Her cheek flamed with pain, but her heart hurt worse. Not from Adrian's violence, but from the way her son Daniel remained rooted in place, his eyes darting, his lips pressed tight, too cowardly to intervene. The band stopped playing. The bride burst into tears. Guests whispered, some pulling out phones, others too shocked to move. Margaret stood silently, her dignity intact, though inside she felt her world cracking. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about what it revealed. Adrian didn't see her as family. He saw her as an obstacle, something to be removed. And Daniel, her own flesh and blood, saw her as expendable. Margaret excused herself quietly, ignoring the stares and murmurs. She stepped into the hallway outside the ballroom, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Her breath came in shallow bursts. For a long moment, she stared at her reflection in the mirrored wall, the redness blooming across her cheek, the sadness in her eyes. But then her expression hardened. She pulled her phone from her purse, hands no longer trembling. She dialed a number she had prayed she would never have to call. "Victor," she whispered when the line connected. "Bring the papers. It's time." Victor Cruz, her financial advisor and one of the few people who knew the truth about her hidden wealth, didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Understood. 20 minutes." Margaret ended the call, drew in a long, steadying breath, and straightened her back. When she returned, she would not be the meek widow who could be slapped and silenced. She would return as the woman who controlled millions, the woman who had been quietly financing her son's life for years, the woman they thought weak but who would prove to be their undoing. She turned toward the ballroom doors, her decision made. Inside, guests would soon see not a victim, but a reckoning. And Adrian, along with Daniel, would soon learn the cost of underestimating Margaret Lawson. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. Chapter 2 will reveal what Margaret has secretly built, and why Adrian and Daniel's scheme is about to collapse. The ballroom doors closed behind Margaret, but her mind was already elsewhere, on memories she had buried deep and accounts she had kept hidden even from her own son. As she waited for Victor's arrival, she thought of the life she and Henry, her late husband, had built quietly, carefully, piece by piece. To everyone else, they were ordinary, just a middle-class couple raising one child in the suburbs of Chicago. But that was never the full truth. Henry had been a visionary in his own right. He started as a small-time contractor, then transitioned into property development during the booming 80s. Where others saw abandoned warehouses, Henry saw lofts that could be sold for 6 times their value. Where others ignored vacant storefronts, he imagined bustling restaurants. He was relentless in his work, and Margaret stood beside him through every deal, every risk, every sleepless night. By the time Henry passed unexpectedly 15 years ago, they had accumulated far more than anyone would believe. A portfolio of rental properties downtown bringing in 6 figures each month, investments in tech companies that had since exploded in value, and a beach house in Florida so secluded it was practically invisible to the world. The total, over $7 million. But Margaret never flaunted it. She kept her thrift store dresses, her old sedan, her modest apartment. She'd seen too many families destroyed by money, and she vowed never to let greed poison hers. At least, that had been the plan. When Daniel was younger, he'd been kind-hearted, generous, and protective of his mother. But somewhere along the way, after marrying Adrian's sister, after slipping into Adrian's world of easy charm and expensive taste, Daniel changed. He stopped visiting except when he needed something. He stopped calling unless the bills piled too high. He started echoing Adrian's patronizing tone. "Mom, you shouldn't be driving anymore. Mom, don't you think you're too old to manage your bills?" The manipulation was obvious. Adrian whispered, Daniel repeated. Margaret's financial advisor, Victor Cruz, had been the one to confirm her fears. One afternoon, just 6 months before the wedding, Victor sat across from her at his office table, a folder of documents spread out before him. "They've taken out over $200,000 in debt," he said, his voice even but edged with concern. "Credit cards maxed. Car loans are unpaid. And this wedding." He tapped the folder. $70,000, entirely financed on loans. "They are drowning, Margaret." Margaret had clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles pale. "And you're certain Adrian has been researching guardianship?" Victor's eyes softened. "Yes. I found inquiries under his name. He's been contacting attorneys about how to have you declared mentally incompetent. If he convinces Daniel to go along, they could gain control over your assets, at least, the ones they know about." Margaret's stomach had dropped at the time, though she'd managed to hide her panic. Guardianship was a weapon she had seen wielded before, stripping elderly parents of autonomy and transferring everything to so-called caretakers. The fact that her son and his brother-in-law were even considering it was betrayal enough. That was when she began preparing. Quietly. Victor set up new protections, trusts they couldn't touch, accounts hidden under LLCs and foundations. He encouraged her to document everything, every payment she made toward Daniel's bills, every transfer she covered. By the time of the wedding, Margaret had proof of over $200,000 given freely, lovingly, and ungratefully to her son and his household. And tonight, after the slap, she decided it was time to expose it all. Outside the ballroom, 20 minutes after her call, Victor arrived. He was a tall man in his 50s, sharp suit, silver hair, and the calm presence of someone who had seen both fortunes rise and empires fall. In his hands, he carried a sleek black briefcase. "You're sure?" he asked quietly as they stood in the hallway. Margaret's cheek still bore the redness of Adrian's hand. She nodded. "I've stayed silent too long. If I don't do this now, I'll lose everything, including myself." Victor gave a single, firm nod. "Then let's show them who you really are." When Margaret re-entered the ballroom, whispers still rippled through the crowd. Adrian sat stiffly at the head table, jaw clenched, his arm draped around his trembling new bride. Daniel paced near the stage, phone in hand, as though frantically texting someone. But when Margaret stepped onto the stage beside Victor, a hush fell over the room. She did not look like the frail widow Adrian had painted her to be. Her back was straight, her gaze unwavering. The microphone in her hand didn't tremble. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying strength that surprised even herself, "I apologize for the interruption. I know tonight is meant to be a celebration. But before we continue, there is something you all need to know." She paused, scanning the sea of faces. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, others with dawning recognition that this was no ordinary family drama. "For years," she continued, "I have lived modestly. Many of you know me as Margaret Lawson, the woman who drives an old sedan, shops at thrift stores, and rents a small apartment. What you don't know, what my son and son-in-law have never bothered to ask, is that behind the simplicity, I have carried more than they ever imagined." Gasps stirred. Adrian's face paled. Daniel froze. "In the last 3 years," Margaret said, her voice tightening with emotion, "I have paid over $200,000 to support my son and his household. His rent, his car, his credit cards, even this wedding. And yet, tonight, I was struck across the face for refusing to hand over the keys to my home." A ripple of outrage spread through the crowd. Phones lifted, recording. Victor opened the briefcase and handed her a stack of documents. Margaret raised them high. "I have the proof. Every bill I paid. Every debt I covered. And tonight, I tell you this, it ends. Effective immediately, all support is cut off. My resources will no longer fund greed." The silence that followed was sharp, heavy. "And more than that," Margaret added, her voice now iron, "I am changing my will. Not a cent, not a single property or investment, will go to Daniel or Adrian. Every dollar will now go to charities protecting seniors from abuse. You wanted me weak, but you have only revealed your own." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others gasping, everyone talking at once. Adrian leapt from his chair, his mask of charm fully shattered into rage. He lunged forward, but security guards moved quickly, blocking his path. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt the weight lift. She was no longer prey. She was powerful. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. Chapter 3 will show the fallout of Margaret's revelation and how the night spirals even further out of Adrian and Daniel's control. The ballroom had erupted into chaos. Margaret stood firm on the stage, the documents still in her hand, her cheek still red from Adrian's slap. She was no longer the frail widow they thought she was. She was the storm that had just torn through the wedding. Gasps gave way to shouts. Guests whispered furiously, phones raised high as they captured every second of the drama. Within hours, it would be all over social media, but for now, the humiliation was confined to 4 decorated walls, where every chandelier sparkled like a cruel spotlight on Daniel and Adrian. Adrian's voice cracked first. "You think you can embarrass me like this? At my own wedding?" His polished charm had vanished, replaced with raw fury. "You're nothing but a crazy old woman. Nobody believes you." But the murmurs said otherwise. People did believe her. They had seen the slap, the silence of Daniel, the dignified way Margaret laid out her truth. Daniel rushed forward, grabbing the microphone. "Mom, please," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. Adrian didn't mean." Margaret turned her gaze on him, sharp and unflinching. "Didn't mean? Daniel, he struck me in front of 200 witnesses. And you stood there, silent. You let him." The words stung. Daniel's face crumpled, torn between shame and panic. But the venue manager, a broad man in a black suit, cut in. His voice carried across the hall. "Mrs. Lawson, just to confirm, you said the payment guarantee for this event is cancelled." Margaret nodded. "Cancelled. Effective immediately." A ripple of shock rolled through the room. The manager's face hardened. He turned toward Adrian and Daniel. "Then, gentlemen, I'll need the balance, $60,000, paid tonight. Or this event shuts down, right now." The crowd gasped again. Guests glanced at one another, some grabbing their coats, sensing the unraveling of the night. Adrian's face turned ashen. He grabbed Daniel's arm. "Do something." Daniel stammered. We don't have it right now, but." "No excuses," the manager snapped. "Pay it, or the music stops, the lights go off, and everyone leaves." The DJ, sensing the tension, froze mid-song. The bride, Adrian's new wife, began to sob at the head table, mascara streaking down her face. Adrian, what's happening? You said everything was covered.
Adrian rounded on her.
Shut up, Elise. Just, shut up.
The room recoiled at the venom in his tone.
His mask had completely fallen, revealing the predator beneath.
Meanwhile, phones buzzed.
Clips of Margaret's revelation were already being uploaded. The video of Adrian's slap, Margaret's calm defiance, and the manager demanding payment was spreading with captions like "Mother of the bride destroys greedy son-in-law at wedding" and "Elder abuse exposed live at reception." Adrian could feel it, his reputation slipping away in real time. He lunged again, breaking past one of the security guards, but Victor stepped forward. Calm, collected, and prepared, Victor raised a hand. "Touch her again," he said evenly, "and you'll be leaving in handcuffs before the cake is cut." Adrian froze. Security tightened around Margaret and Victor. Margaret took the microphone once more. Her voice was cool, deliberate. "This is only the beginning. I have evidence of every dollar I've paid on Daniel's behalf. Rent, insurance, credit cards, even your down payments for this wedding. $200,000, given out of love. And yet, you repay me with greed and humiliation." Guests gasped again. Adrian's mother, seated near the front, buried her face in her hands. Elise, the bride, sobbed harder. Margaret's gaze swept the crowd. "Tonight you've all witnessed the truth. And tomorrow, the world will see it too. I will no longer be silent. And Daniel," her eyes locked onto her son, whose face had gone pale, "you will no longer be my heir." Daniel staggered back as if the words were a physical blow. The atmosphere turned icy. Guests began filing toward the exits, murmuring to each other. The manager gave Adrian and Daniel one last warning: pay, or the wedding was over. They had nothing. Credit cards declined. Bank accounts are empty. The illusion of wealth they had built crumbled in front of everyone. Daniel turned desperately to Margaret. "Mom, please, just one more time. Cover this, and I swear we'll fix everything. I'll come visit. I'll." But Margaret's hand rose, silencing him. "You've had 3 years of my support. I gave until it hurt me. And all I asked in return was love. Tonight, I see that love died long ago." The words cut deeper than the slap. Daniel's lips trembled. He glanced at Adrian, whose rage had twisted into despair, then back at Margaret. But she had already turned away. Victor closed the briefcase. "We're done here." And with that, Margaret walked off the stage, security flanking her, Victor steady at her side. The last thing she heard as the ballroom doors closed behind her was Adrian's voice, broken and furious. "She'll regret this. You'll all see." But Margaret only smiled faintly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like prey. She felt like justice itself. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. Chapter 4 will dive into the morning after, when the videos go viral, and Adrian and Daniel's carefully constructed world begins to collapse. By dawn, the story had spread like wildfire. The first video to go viral wasn't Margaret's speech, it was the slap. A shaky clip, recorded by a teenager at table 12, showed Adrian striking her across the face, the crack echoing through the ballroom before the camera swung wildly to capture guests gasping in shock. Within hours, the clip had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times on TikTok, tagged with captions like #elderabuse_exposed and #weddingfromhell. The second viral clip was even worse for Adrian and Daniel. It showed Margaret standing on stage, documents in hand, her voice steady. "I have paid over $200,000 to support my son and his household. And tonight, I was struck across the face for refusing to hand over the keys to my home." The raw emotion in her voice, coupled with the stunned silence of the crowd, struck a chord with viewers everywhere. By breakfast, Margaret Lawson had become a symbol. Brave widow confronts abusers at daughter's wedding. Mother humiliated, fights back live. Elder abuse caught on camera. The hashtags were endless. The outrage was real. And Adrian and Daniel, once smug and untouchable, were now internet villains. Meanwhile, Margaret sat quietly in her kitchen, sipping tea, her phone buzzing non-stop. She had turned off notifications after the 50th call. Reporters wanted interviews. Lawyers wanted statements. Strangers wanted to offer support. Victor sat across from her, scrolling through headlines on his tablet. "It's everywhere," he said softly. "Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Your name is trending nationally." Margaret set down her cup. Her hands were steady now. I never wanted fame, Victor. All I wanted was respect.
You have it, Victor assured her. And not just from strangers. The law is already paying attention.
Elder abuse cases rarely get this kind of visibility.
You forced it into the spotlight. Margaret exhaled slowly, realizing the weight of what had begun. This was no longer just a fight.
Across town, Adrian and Daniel woke to a nightmare. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, not with congratulations, but with calls from debt collectors, journalists, and furious family members demanding answers. Adrian's company issued a statement distancing themselves from him, calling the incident inexcusable and under review.
By noon, he was suspended without pay. Daniel fared no better.
His office left him a single message: "Don't bother coming in until this is sorted."
Friends unfollowed him in droves.
Even neighbors looked at him differently, whispering when he tried to leave the apartment. Adrian paced their cramped living room, his face twisted in rage.
She set us up.
That old witch set us up. Daniel, pale and exhausted, sank into the couch.
She didn't set us up, Adrian. We did this to ourselves. Adrian whirled on him. Don't you dare blame me.
If you'd controlled her, if you'd gotten those keys, we wouldn't be in this mess.
Daniel rubbed his temples. The pounding in his skull felt unbearable. You hit her, Adrian. In front of everyone. There's no coming back from that. But Adrian refused to hear it.
His pride wouldn't allow him to face the truth. The empire they had tried to build on lies and manipulation had collapsed overnight. At the same time, the ballroom staff was still reeling from the chaos. The manager, interviewed by a local news station, confirmed Margaret's announcement. The balance was unpaid, he said firmly.
We shut the event down before midnight. Guests were asked to leave.
It was the most disastrous wedding I've ever seen. That soundbite made its way onto the evening news, replayed alongside clips of Margaret's speech.
Her calm dignity.
Adrian's explosive rage. Daniel's silence. The narrative was clear, and the public had chosen sides. That afternoon, Margaret met with Victor again, this time at his office. He had pulled together more than just financial records. He had compiled medical documentation of the slap, witness statements from guests, and copies of Adrian's online searches about guardianship. This, Victor said, tapping the file, is enough to not only protect you but to bury them legally. Elder abuse.
Conspiracy to defraud. Guardianship fraud.
They're in deep trouble.
Margaret stared at the stack of papers.
It felt strange, almost surreal, to see her private pain laid out in black and white. For so long, she had lived quietly, hiding her wealth, hiding her power. And now the truth was roaring into daylight, undeniable and unstoppable.
File it, she said finally. Every charge we can.
I want them held accountable, not just for me, but for every other senior they think they can exploit.
Victor nodded with quiet approval.
Consider it done. By nightfall, the news stations had picked up the story nationwide. Margaret's face appeared on cable networks, her voice playing in clips. You wanted me weak, but you have only revealed your own. The line became a rallying cry, quoted by activists, reshared in endless tweets, and even printed on protest signs outside courthouses.
Margaret Lawson was no longer just a widow from Chicago.
She was the face of resistance against elder abuse. Meanwhile, Adrian and Daniel's desperation deepened. Adrian, seething, scrolled through hateful comments online.
We'll sue her, he snarled. We'll say she's unstable. Senile. That this was all an act. Daniel hesitated. His gut told him it was useless, but fear made him nod anyway.
Maybe if we can find people who'll testify, say she was acting strange at the wedding.
Adrian's eyes lit up with cruel hope. Exactly. We'll flip the story.
She'll regret ever crossing us. But what neither of them realized was that the tide had already turned. The footage was too clear, the evidence too strong, the public too enraged.
Their plan would crumble before it even began.
And Margaret, finally free from silence, was only getting started. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. Chapter 5 will show how Adrian and Daniel tried to fight back with lies and manipulation, only to find themselves sinking deeper into ruin. What happens when two desperate men, backed into a corner, try to twist the truth? Instead of saving themselves, they dig their own graves deeper. This is the revenge you've been waiting for, raw, emotional, and unstoppable. The internet didn't sleep. Every clip, every meme, every angry comment about Adrian and Daniel built momentum overnight. By the time the sun rose, They weren't just trending, they were infamous. People called them the wedding villains. Adrian's smug face, frozen in mid-shout, became a viral reaction image. Daniel's blank stare was plastered on tweets with captions like, "When you realize mom has the receipts." But instead of laying low, Adrian and Daniel made the worst decision of their lives. They decided to fight back. Inside their cluttered apartment, the mood was toxic. Adrian barked orders while Daniel slumped in front of his laptop. "We're not letting her win," Adrian snapped. "We'll flip the narrative. Make her look unstable. Senile. We'll say she's been delusional ever since Dad died. People love a tragic story." Daniel hesitated, staring at the blinking cursor on a half-written statement. What if no one believes it? The videos are everywhere. Adrian slammed his fist on the table. "Then we make them believe. Get friends to testify. Call in favors. Hire a PR firm if we have to." His voice was sharp, desperate, like a man clinging to the last shred of power. Their first move was a post on social media, a shaky, poorly written attempt to reframe Margaret as a troubled widow. Daniel typed while Adrian dictated. "We love our mother dearly, but sadly she has been struggling emotionally and mentally since our father's passing. Last night was not what it seemed. The videos don't show the full story." The post went live. Adrian leaned back with a smug smile. "That'll do it. People will pity us. They'll think she had an episode." But the internet wasn't buying it. Comments poured in immediately. "Gaslighting your own mother? Disgusting. You hit her on camera, Adrian. No excuses. She looked stronger and saner than both of you put together." By the end of the hour, their post had backfired spectacularly. Instead of sympathy, it fueled more anger. The second move was worse. Adrian called an old friend, someone with connections at a local tabloid. By evening, a headline appeared online. "Exclusive, Widow's shocking breakdown, was the wedding outburst a cry for help." The article painted Margaret as paranoid and bitter, claiming anonymous family sources confirmed she had fabricated stories of financial abuse. But Margaret had an army now. Thousands of strangers, fans, and even legal advocates flooded the comments section, dismantling every lie. Screenshots of Adrian's expensive lifestyle, cars, vacations, shopping sprees, were posted alongside evidence of Margaret's payments. The hashtag #WeStandWithMargaret climbed higher than ever. The tabloid quietly pulled the story within hours. While Adrian fumed, Margaret remained calm. She sat in Victor's office, watching the chaos unfold on his computer. "They are scrambling," Victor said with quiet satisfaction. "Every move they make digs them in deeper. The public won't tolerate this kind of manipulation anymore." The slap sealed their fate. Margaret nodded, her face steady. "For years, I was afraid of them. Afraid of their tempers, their greed. But look at them now, fighting shadows while the truth stands tall." Victor leaned forward. "Are you ready to take this to the next step? The legal charges?" Margaret's eyes hardened. "Yes. It's time." Back in the apartment, tension boiled over. Daniel was unraveling. "We should stop, Adrian. Everything we post, everything we say, it only makes it worse. People hate us. They are digging into our past. They are finding everything." Adrian's face twisted with fury. "So what? Let them dig. We'll sue her for defamation. We'll drag her name through the courts until she breaks." Daniel shook his head. "She's not breaking. Can't you see that? She's stronger than we thought." For the first time, Daniel's voice cracked with fear. But Adrian, blinded by rage, refused to admit defeat. The breaking point came 2 days later. Adrian went live on social media. His face filled the screen, pale and tense, his tone defensive. "I just want to say this, none of you know the full story. My mother, she's been unstable for years. We've tried to help her, but she refuses. That slap? That was me defending myself. She attacked me first." The lies were clumsy. The delivery, desperate. And within minutes, the live stream was clipped, mocked, and shared across platforms. One viral tweet read, "Bro gaslights his own mom live and thinks we'll buy it." Another, "Self-defense? Against a 70-year-old widow with receipts? Sit down, Adrian." The damage was irreversible. Meanwhile, Margaret's resolve deepened. She had watched the live stream, her jaw tightening. But instead of anger, she felt a surge of clarity. "They are digging their graves," she whispered to herself. "And I will not stop until justice fills them in." The community rallied harder. Activists for elder rights invited Margaret to speak at events.
Strangers sent letters of support.
A retired judge even reached out, offering free consultation on her case. Margaret Lawson was no longer a victim.
She was becoming a movement.
Adrian and Daniel thought their counterattack would save them. But each lie, each desperate move, only exposed their corruption further. And in the shadows, Margaret and Victor were preparing the strike that would end this battle once and for all. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 6, Margaret finally launches her legal battle, one that will drag every secret, every fraud, and every abuse into the light. They thought she was too old, too fragile, too weak to fight back. But Margaret Lawson was about to walk into court and prove that her age was not her weakness, it was her weapon. This was no longer a family dispute. This was war. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where truth was supposed to outlive lies. Margaret stood at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Victor's arm for support, though she didn't need it.
She wasn't frail. She wasn't weak.
Today, she was a storm wrapped in the body of a 70-year-old widow. Across the hall, Adrian and Daniel stood with their lawyer, whispering furiously. Adrian's jaw clenched, his arrogance now mixed with the kind of fear he couldn't disguise. Daniel's face was pale, sweat trickling down his neck. The bailiff called the case. The People versus Adrian Clark and Daniel Lawson, charges of elder abuse, financial coercion, and fraud. The words echoed through the chamber, heavy as a hammer.
Margaret's attorney rose first.
A woman in her 40s named Grace Layton, sharp-eyed and steady-voiced. Your Honor, what happened at that wedding was not just a family disagreement. It was the breaking point of a calculated campaign to strip Margaret Lawson of her dignity, her independence, and her financial security. We will show evidence of manipulation, coercion, and outright abuse. We will show how two men, her own son and her son-in-law, schemed to take everything she had.
Gasps rippled softly through the courtroom gallery.
When Adrian's lawyer responded, his words dripped with practiced charm. This is a tragic case of misunderstanding. The defense will show that Mrs. Lawson has been suffering mental decline since the death of her husband. My clients acted out of concern, not malice. But his words rang hollow, especially with the video evidence queued up on the screens. The first clip played, Adrian slapping Margaret at the wedding.
The silence in the courtroom was unbearable.
The sound of the slap cracked through the speakers, followed by Margaret's stunned expression and the gasps of the crowd.
The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats.
Margaret's attorney let the silence linger before speaking. Concern for her?
That is what you just witnessed?
Concern. Adrian looked away, jaw tight.
Daniel's hands shook in his lap.
Next came the financial records. Victor took the stand, laying out documents, checks, wire transfers, credit card payments. For 3 years, he testified, Mrs. Lawson supported her son Daniel financially. Rent, utilities, credit card debt, even his car insurance. In total, over $200,000. She also financed portions of the wedding, funds that were disguised as gifts but were, in truth, coerced under emotional manipulation. He looked directly at the defense table. They were drowning in debt, and they saw her as their lifeline. When she resisted giving more, they turned to force.
Adrian's lawyer tried to object, but the judge overruled.
The evidence was too clear. Daniel finally took the stand. His lawyer had insisted it would make him look sympathetic. But under cross-examination, sympathy evaporated. Mr. Lawson, Grace began, her voice calm but sharp, is it true that your mother paid your rent for over 2 years?
Daniel swallowed.
Yes. And your car? Yes. And your credit cards?
Yes.
Is it also true that she helped pay for your wedding to Adrian Clark? Daniel hesitated, glancing at Adrian. Yes. Grace stepped closer. So when your mother refused to give you the keys to her apartment, what happened?
Daniel's voice cracked.
Adrian, he slapped her. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Margaret sat tall, her eyes fixed on her son. For the first time, Daniel couldn't meet her gaze. When Adrian took the stand, he was defiant. I was defending myself, he said flatly.
She came at me. She's unstable.
Everyone knows it. Grace clicked her remote. The video replayed, the slap, the silence, Margaret recoiling in shock.
Defending yourself? She asked.
Against this.
The clip froze on Margaret's stunned face. Adrian's silence was his answer. By the time closing arguments came, the case was no longer just evidence and testimony. It was about dignity. Grace's final words rang like a verdict before the jury even left their seats. Margaret Lawson was not weak. She was not unstable. She was preyed upon by those who should have loved her most. But instead of breaking, she chose to fight.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to send a message that elder abuse, manipulation, and betrayal have consequences. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. On the charge of elder abuse, guilty. On the charge of financial coercion, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty.
Adrian's face collapsed into rage. Daniel closed his eyes, his body sagging with defeat.
The judge's sentence was swift: fines totaling $100,000, restitution to the victim, and probation. Failure to comply will result in imprisonment.
The clang of the gavel was music to Margaret's ears. As they were let out, Adrian shot one last glare at Margaret. But she didn't flinch. She met his rage with silence, her eyes harder than steel.
Daniel tried to mouth something, perhaps an apology, perhaps another plea, but the bailiff pushed him forward.
Margaret didn't care to know.
She turned to Victor and Grace, her voice low but steady.
This isn't the end.
It's the beginning.
For Margaret, the courtroom was not just a victory.
It was a declaration. She had turned humiliation into power, and now she was ready to build something greater than revenge, something that would outlive her. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 7, Margaret takes a fight beyond the courtroom and into the public eye, transforming her pain into a movement. They thought her voice would be silenced in the courtroom, but instead, it echoed across America. Margaret Lawson's humiliation was broadcast to millions, not as her downfall, but as her rebirth. What Adrian and Daniel never understood was that revenge doesn't always come with fists or fury. Sometimes, it comes with a microphone and a nation listening. It began with a single video. A guest at the wedding had filmed the entire confrontation: the slap, the stunned silence, Margaret's return with Victor, and the damning revelations.
The video spread like wildfire.
By the time the courtroom verdict was read, Margaret Lawson was no longer just a widow defending herself. She was a symbol. The hashtags told the story: #Justice for Margaret, #Elder Abuse Awareness, #Strength at 70. Across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, millions watched her calm dignity against Adrian's violence and Daniel's silence. Comment sections overflowed with outrage, support, and admiration. Look at her face. How did she hold it together after being slapped like that? She's tougher than anyone in that room.
This isn't just a story.
This is happening everywhere.
The phone calls began within days.
Producers from talk shows, journalists from major newspapers, and even podcasters who wanted her voice. Margaret, who had once avoided attention, found herself at the center of a storm.
At first, she hesitated. Public speaking was not her world.
But Victor leaned across the table one afternoon and said, "Margaret, this isn't about you anymore. It's about every senior who doesn't have the means to fight. You're their voice." And so she agreed. Her first major appearance was on Echoes of Courage, a primetime television special that profiled ordinary people who had overcome extraordinary trials. The cameras rolled as she sat in a softly lit studio, her hands folded in her lap. The host leaned forward. "Margaret, millions of people have seen what happened to you. But what they don't know is the years of quiet abuse that led to that moment. Would you tell us your story?" Margaret inhaled slowly, then began. She spoke of her modest life, her thrift store clothes, the old car, the grocery store job. She told the world why she had lived that way, how she and her late husband Henry had hidden their wealth not out of shame, but out of protection.
Then came the unraveling.
How Adrian's disdain turned into manipulation. How Daniel, her only son, fell under his influence. How she overheard their plans to have her declared incompetent. And finally, how Adrian's hand had struck her across the face at her daughter's wedding, shattering her silence forever. The studio was hushed. Even the cameras seemed to lean in. "And what did you feel in that moment?" the host asked. Margaret's eyes sharpened. "For 20 minutes, I felt broken. But after 20 minutes, I remembered who I was. And I decided to show them I was not weak. They wanted my keys. They wanted my apartment. They wanted my life. Instead, I gave them nothing, and I took back everything." The episode aired on a Sunday evening. By Monday morning, Margaret Lawson was a household name. Her story resonated far beyond elder abuse. Viewers saw their own betrayals in hers, children who had turned greedy, spouses who had turned cruel, families who had mistaken silence for weakness. Letters poured in from cines who had been manipulated, from women who had endured domestic violence, from men who had been discarded by their own families.
"You gave me courage," one letter read.
"I left the nursing home my daughter forced me into. I took back my bank account."
Another, "I thought I was alone. But now I know I'm not. Thank you."
Margaret could have basked in her newfound fame, but she wasn't interested in applause.
She wanted action.
Within 3 months, she announced the creation of the Lawson Foundation for Elder Justice. The mission was bold: provide legal aid, financial counseling, and safe housing for seniors facing abuse or exploitation. She redirected her will, every dollar, every property, every investment, to the foundation. Reporters called it radical. Margaret called it necessary. "They took my son from me," she said in one interview, "but I won't let them take another senior's dignity. If I can stop even one person from going through what I did, then my suffering has meaning." Meanwhile, Adrian and Daniel's lives spiraled. Everywhere they went, whispers followed. Job applications disappeared when employers Googled their names. Neighbors turned cold. Daniel tried to argue that the media had exaggerated, but no one listened.
He was the son who had stood silent while his mother was slapped.
Adrian, meanwhile, was recognized in grocery store aisles and heckled in parking lots. "Elder abuser," strangers shouted. The irony was brutal: the more Margaret rose, the further they fell. But Margaret's revenge wasn't gloating over their misery.
It was watching her foundation grow.
By the 6-month mark, the Lawson Foundation had helped recover over $2 million in stolen or coerced assets. Seniors who had been silenced now had lawyers, therapists, and support groups.
Margaret's name had become a shield.
She traveled across the U.S., speaking at conferences, appearing in state legislatures, and advocating for stricter penalties against elder abuse. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding. She had once been just a widow in thrift store dresses.
Now, she was a movement.
In private moments, she still mourned. She would sit in her quiet apartment, surrounded by flowers from supporters, and feel the hollow space where her son's love should have been.
But she never let the grief turn her back. Instead, she let it sharpen her resolve.
"They thought the slap was the end of me," she whispered once to Victor. "But it was only the beginning." Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 8, Margaret sharpens her revenge further, cutting off her son's future completely with one devastating decision about her legacy. They wanted her apartment, her keys, her silence. What they didn't know was that Margaret Lawson's true power wasn't in what she owned, it was in deciding who would inherit it. And with one stroke of a pen, she erased her son and his husband from her future forever. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across a stack of documents. The sound of her pen scratching against paper was deliberate, final.
This wasn't just paperwork. It was a weapon.
Across from her, Victor Cruz watched quietly. He had seen Margaret through humiliation, courtroom battles, and her rise to national recognition.
But today, he could see the weight in her eyes.
"Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked gently. Margaret looked up, her expression steel. "I have never been more sure of anything.
They wanted to take everything from me.
Instead, I'll make sure they never touch a cent, not now, not ever." She tapped the final page of her will. "This is my legacy, Victor. And it belongs to people who will honor it, not destroy it." For decades, Margaret had kept her wealth hidden. $7 million in investments, a downtown office building generating 6 figures a month, a secluded beach house. To Daniel and Adrian, she had been a frail woman in thrift store dresses.
But the truth was this: she controlled an empire.
Now, she would decide who inherited it. And the answer was devastating, for Daniel. The lawyer arrived that evening, her briefcase filled with crisp legal papers. Margaret signed slowly, each movement deliberate. With her signature, every asset, her investments, her properties, her accounts, was redirected to the Lawson Foundation for Elder Justice.
But there was more.
She included a specific clause that ensured Daniel Lawson and Adrian Clark were permanently disinherited. No challenge would hold. No appeal would succeed. "Name them explicitly," Margaret instructed. "I don't want loopholes." The lawyer nodded, scribbling. "Daniel Lawson and Adrian Clark are excluded from any inheritance or benefit, direct or indirect, from the estate of Margaret Lawson.
It was final. Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhaling.
For a moment, she felt the grief of a mother who had just severed her last tie to her only child. But then the rage returned, the memory of that slap, the silence of Daniel, the years of manipulation. "They didn't just betray me," she whispered. "They betrayed everything Henry and I worked for. And for that, they get nothing." News of her decision spread quickly. A leak from the law office made its way into the press. Margaret Lawson disinherits only son, leaves multimillion-dollar estate to Elder Justice Foundation. The headlines exploded. Widow who went viral cuts son out of will. National symbol of elder abuse turns legacy into weapon. Margaret Lawson's brutal act of justice. The public reaction was immediate. Supporters praised her strength. She's doing what so many parents are too afraid to do. She turned pain into protection. That's real love. But for Daniel, it was a knife in the heart. He showed up at her apartment 2 nights later, eyes red, his body reeking of whiskey.
He pounded on the door until she opened.
"Mom, you can't do this," he begged, voice cracking.
"You're my mother. I'm your son.
You can't just cut me out of your life like that." Margaret stood in the doorway, her frame straight, her face unreadable. "You cut yourself out, Daniel," she said quietly. "The night you stood there and watched your husband hit me, you chose him over me. You chose greed over love. That was the moment you lost me." Daniel fell to his knees.
"I was scared. I didn't know what to do. But I'm your blood, Mom. You can't erase me like this."
Margaret's voice hardened. "Blood doesn't excuse betrayal. Blood doesn't buy back dignity.
You will not see a dime from me.
Not now, not when I'm gone."
She closed the door.
On the other side, Daniel's sobs echoed down the hall. But Margaret wasn't finished. Her most brutal move was yet to come. The creation of a trust fund for Oliver, Daniel and Adrian's young son. Margaret had never met her grandson, but she loved him fiercely in the way only a grandmother could. She wanted him protected, from his parents, from their greed, from their mistakes. She established a fund that would cover Oliver's education, healthcare, and future stability. But the clause was ironclad. Daniel Lawson would have no control over it. Adrian Clark would have no access. Only independent trustees, overseen by the Lawson Foundation, could release funds. "I'll provide for the boy," Margaret told Victor. "But his father will never use him as a weapon against me." When Daniel discovered the trust, his anger was volcanic. "She's giving money to Oliver but nothing to me," he raged to Adrian. "She's cutting me out of my own son's life." Adrian sneered. "Face it, Daniel.
She's smarter than both of us.
We lost." Daniel smashed a glass against the wall, his face contorted in fury.
"She's not done with me.
I'll find a way." But deep down, he knew the truth. Margaret's decision was ironclad. His inheritance was gone. His future with her was gone. Margaret, meanwhile, felt a strange peace. She had turned the deepest wound of her life, the betrayal of her only child, into a legacy that would protect thousands.
It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation.
It was revenge, sharpened into justice. Her apartment, once a symbol of vulnerability, was now the war room of a woman who had defeated her abusers with dignity, intelligence, and fire. She poured herself a cup of tea, looking out at the city skyline. "They wanted everything," she murmured. "I gave them nothing. And I'll give the world everything instead." Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 9, Margaret's revenge takes on new dimensions as Adrian and Daniel's lives spiral into bankruptcy, job loss, and public disgrace, while Margaret builds an empire of justice from their ruins. They thought they could strip a 70-year-old widow of her dignity, her apartment, her very life. But Margaret Lawson didn't just fight back, she destroyed them. While she rose into the light, Adrian and Daniel descended into ruin, their empire of lies collapsing piece by piece. This was not an accident. This was revenge. The judgment had been swift, but the consequences were merciless. Adrian and Daniel left the courthouse with fines they couldn't pay, reputations they couldn't fix, and a future that looked like a burnt-out wasteland. It began with the fines, $100,000 in restitution and penalties. Neither man had the savings to cover it. Their accounts, already drowning in debt, went into free fall. Collection agencies called daily, letters piled up at their door, and threats of seizure loomed. Adrian lost his job within weeks. His employer, a tech firm that prided itself on integrity, couldn't ignore the headlines. Employee charged with elder abuse was not a story they wanted tied to their brand. Daniel, meanwhile, was evicted. His landlord had tolerated late payments before, but with a public scandal and his inability to pay rent, the decision was final. One afternoon, Daniel came home to find his belongings on the sidewalk, stuffed into garbage bags. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, some whispering, others openly glaring. "Isn't that the guy who let his husband slap his own mother?" one muttered.
"That's him."
"Disgusting."
Daniel's face burned with shame.
By the third month, their marriage began to crack. Adrian grew resentful, blaming Daniel for their downfall. "If your mother had just handed over those damn keys, none of this would have happened," he shouted, slamming a chair into the wall. Daniel shot back, his voice hoarse from stress. "You think this is my fault? You're the one who hit her. You're the one everyone saw." They screamed until their throats ached, their words knives meant to wound. But beneath the anger was something worse, fear.
Neither had a plan. Neither had allies.
The lavish wedding that was supposed to launch their lives had instead become their obituary. Margaret, on the other hand, was thriving. Her foundation was gaining traction, her story was inspiring millions, and invitations poured in for her to speak at universities, conferences, and even government hearings. The more Adrian and Daniel fell, the higher she climbed.
Reporters noted the contrast.
Margaret Lawson launches Elder Justice Foundation while son declares bankruptcy. The widow who rose, the men who fell. Adrian and Daniel couldn't escape it. Every headline, every news clip, was another blow. Bankruptcy came next. Daniel sat in the lawyer's office, staring at the paperwork that declared his financial death. Chapter 7 Bankruptcy, the lawyer explained. "It'll wipe out most of your debt, but your credit will be ruined for years. And any assets you do have are gone."
Daniel laughed bitterly.
"Assets? What assets?" Adrian muttered under his breath. "We had one asset. Your mother."
The lawyer raised an eyebrow. Daniel's cheeks flamed.
"She's not our asset anymore," Daniel admitted quietly. As the months dragged on, humiliation followed them like a shadow. They were forced to move into a cramped apartment owned by Adrian's parents, who resented every day of their stay. The once proud couple who had flaunted wealth and status now shared a single bedroom with peeling wallpaper and broken blinds. Daniel took a part-time job stocking shelves at a discount store. Adrian bounced between short-term gigs, never lasting long once his name was Googled. At night, they sat in silence, the glow of unpaid bills the only light between them.
The final straw came with the trust fund.
News broke publicly that Margaret had set aside a generous trust for Oliver, Daniel and Adrian's son, but had locked them out completely. The press feasted on the story. Grandmother protects grandson, cuts out greedy parents. Lawson's final blow, son disinherited, grandson saved. Adrian threw the newspaper across the room, his face twisted with fury.
"She's mocking us," he spat.
"She's making sure everyone knows we're worthless."
Daniel sat with his head in his hands. "She's not mocking us. She's replacing us.
She doesn't even see us as family anymore." The words hung heavy in the room.
Because deep down, Daniel knew they were true.
Margaret, meanwhile, moved forward with quiet satisfaction.
She didn't celebrate their downfall with champagne or parties. She didn't need to. Their ruin was its own victory.
Instead, she poured her energy into expanding the foundation, creating scholarships for young lawyers to fight elder abuse cases, funding shelters for seniors escaping manipulative relatives, and lobbying Congress for stricter penalties. Every dollar she invested was another reminder, her wealth would never again be used to enable greed. It would be used to destroy it. For Adrian and Daniel, life had become survival. Adrian, once cocky and sharp-tongued, now stared blankly at walls, drowning in cheap whiskey. Daniel, once proud of his middle-class upbringing, now begged family members for small loans just to buy groceries. And yet, the cruelest part of their downfall wasn't the poverty. It was watching Margaret flourish without them. She didn't just survive their abuse. She turned it into fuel. She turned her pain into power. And she turned their betrayal into a legacy that would outlive them both. Revenge isn't always about fire and fury. Sometimes, it's about building something greater from the ashes of betrayal. While Adrian and Daniel drowned in debt and disgrace, Margaret Lawson rose like a phoenix, transforming her pain into a movement that gave hope to millions. But her sweetest victory wasn't found in headlines or donations. It was in the heart of a child, the one thing Adrian and Daniel could never buy back. The foundation had started small. Margaret launched it with a modest office in the city, 2 staff members, and the vision to protect seniors from the kind of exploitation she had endured.
She named it the Lawson Foundation for Elder Justice. But what began as a whisper became a roar.
Within months, donations poured in. The viral videos of her confrontation had stirred public empathy, and wealthy benefactors wanted to be part of her mission. Universities invited her to speak.
Law firms offered pro bono support.
Legislators reached out for her insight on drafting stronger protections. She wasn't just a widow anymore.
She was a force.
On a bright autumn morning, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at a university law school. Cameras rolled as she addressed hundreds of students. "I am not here because I was strong," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I am here because I was broken, and I decided never to be broken again. Elder abuse isn't just about money, it's about dignity. About the right to live without fear in your final years.
My son and his husband thought they could silence me.
Instead, they gave me a voice louder than I ever imagined."
Thunderous applause shook the hall.
Margaret's words were quoted in newspapers, replayed on television, and clipped for social media. Each repetition drew more attention to the foundation. Meanwhile, Adrian and Daniel watched from the shadows of their new reality. They sat in their cramped, peeling apartment, the TV flickering with Margaret's speech. Adrian sneered. "She's milking this for fame. Look at her, parading around like a saint."
Daniel didn't answer.
His eyes lingered on the screen, on his mother's poise, on the crowd rising to their feet for her. For the first time, he felt not anger, but a hollow ache in his chest. "She's not milking it," he whispered finally.
"She's making something of it.
Something we never could." Adrian shot him a glare, but Daniel didn't back down. The silence between them was thicker than ever.
The true shift came with Oliver.
The boy, now old enough to understand the whispers at school, came home one afternoon clutching his phone.
"Dad," he said to Daniel, "is it true? Did you let Uncle Adrian hit Grandma?
Is that why everyone calls you a coward?"
Daniel's throat tightened.
"Oliver, it's not that simple." But Oliver pulled up the viral video.
Adrian's slap. Margaret's defiance. Daniel's silence.
Millions of views, comments flooding with outrage. "It looks simple to me," Oliver said, his voice trembling.
"You didn't protect her. You chose him over her. What kind of son does that?
What kind of father?"
Daniel's heart shattered.
He reached for his son, but Oliver pulled away. "I don't want to be like you," Oliver said. "I want to be like Grandma." From that moment, Oliver began spending more time with Margaret. Weekends were spent at her home, where he helped with foundation events, carried flyers, and even spoke shyly at small gatherings. Margaret treated him with patience, kindness, and pride, qualities Adrian and Daniel had long since abandoned. One evening, after a successful fundraiser, Oliver looked at her with wide eyes. "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to help people like you do," he said.
Margaret hugged him tightly.
"And you will, sweetheart. You'll make me proud every day." For Margaret, that was the sweetest victory. Not the donations,
not the accolades, but knowing the next generation had chosen her path over theirs.
Adrian raged when he found out.
"He's our son," he shouted at Daniel.
"And now she's turning him against us." Daniel shot back with uncharacteristic fire.
"She didn't turn him against us. We did that ourselves. You did, when you hit her. I did, when I stood by and let it happen.
We lost him the moment we chose greed over love." Adrian stormed out, slamming the door so hard the plaster cracked. Daniel sat alone, head in his hands, the weight of regret pressing down harder than ever before. For Margaret, the months rolled on with triumph after triumph. The foundation grew into a national presence. Partnerships formed with healthcare providers, financial institutions, and legal aid clinics. A hotline for elder abuse victims was launched, receiving thousands of calls. At a gala dinner marking the foundation's one-year anniversary, Margaret stood beneath glittering chandeliers, a vision of resilience. Donors applauded, victims thanked her with tears in their eyes, and Oliver, seated proudly at her side, clapped louder than anyone.
Margaret lifted her glass.
"This is not just my victory," she declared. "This is the victory of every elder who has been silenced, every widow who has been forgotten, and every soul who has been betrayed by those they loved. Tonight, we say together, never again."
The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed.
The movement had become unstoppable. And in a dark apartment across town, Adrian and Daniel watched the broadcast on a cracked screen. Margaret glowed, Oliver smiling beside her. Daniel whispered through tears, she doesn't even need us anymore. Adrian, for once, had no reply. Great, let's continue with chapter 11, the movement spreads. As always, this chapter will be exactly 900 words, with a powerful hook at the start, smooth flow from chapter 10, and the call to action at the end. Revenge can start as personal justice, but Margaret Lawson's fight had grown into something larger.
What began with a slap in a wedding hall was now sparking national debate.
She had gone from victim to advocate, from widow to warrior. But with influence came opposition, and the louder her voice became, the more dangerous the enemies she attracted. By the second year of the Lawson Foundation, the ripples Margaret had created turned into waves. The hotline was receiving thousands of calls each month, exposing the scale of elder abuse across the country. Stories poured in. Widows pressured to sign over homes, retirees tricked into draining pensions, grandparents threatened by their own children. For every Margaret Lawson, there were hundreds more suffering in silence.
Her mission had touched a nerve. Television crews followed her.
Morning shows invited her to share her story again and again. She sat under bright lights, facing polished hosts who marveled at her transformation. You've become a symbol of dignity, one anchor told her.
From humiliation to empowerment.
What's next for the Lawson Foundation?
Margaret smiled gently but firmly. Change.
Not just for me, not just for the people who have reached out. We need laws that recognize elder abuse as not just a family issue, but a national crisis. If we can protect children from exploitation, why not our seniors? They deserve the same shield. The clip went viral, shared by advocacy groups, reposted by celebrities, and dissected on talk shows.
Politicians took notice. Soon, Margaret was standing before Congress.
Dressed in a deep navy suit, her silver hair pinned neatly, she looked every bit the formidable witness. Lawmakers leaned forward as she told her story, not with bitterness, but with measured resolve. My son and his husband thought they could strip me of my home, my dignity, and my future.
Instead, they gave me purpose. But not every senior has the resources I had.
Too many suffer in silence, unseen. That silence ends now. Her testimony lit a fire. A bipartisan bill, the Elder Justice and Protection Act, began making its way through committees. The act proposed harsher penalties for financial exploitation, dedicated funding for elder abuse investigations, and new safeguards for guardianship laws.
The foundation had become more than a charity. It was now a lobbying force.
Meanwhile, Margaret's personal life intertwined with her mission in surprising ways. Oliver became her shadow, joining her on trips to Washington, helping with fundraising events, even speaking in his own words. At just 12, he stood before a crowd of donors and said, "My dad and his husband made mistakes.
Big ones. But my grandma showed me you don't have to let bad choices define you. You can fight back. You can help others."
That's what I want to do. The room erupted in applause, donors moved by the innocence of a boy who had chosen his grandmother's path over his father's. Margaret squeezed his hand, a silent vow forming in her heart. She would secure his future, no matter the cost. But with visibility came enemies.
Not everyone applauded Margaret's rise.
Nursing home corporations, shady guardianship lawyers, and financial predators who thrived in the shadows now saw her as a threat. Whispers grew of lobbying efforts to water down her bill, smear campaigns questioning her mental stability, even anonymous letters urging her to step back before it's too late. Victor Cruz, her loyal advisor, cautioned her one evening as they reviewed documents. "You're not just a widow with a cause anymore, Margaret.
You're a political target.
These people have power, and they don't like being exposed."
Margaret's jaw tightened. "Let them come. They can't scare me back into silence. I've already survived the worst betrayal of my life.
What's a few more enemies?" Daniel, however, watched the movement with growing torment. Unable to find steady work, living paycheck to paycheck, he saw his mother's face everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, on billboards for fundraising galas. Every public success was a private reminder of his failure. At night, he replayed Oliver's words, "I don't want to be like you." Regret gnawed at him, but pride and shame kept him from reaching out. Adrian, on the other hand, only grew more bitter. "She's painting us as villains," Adrian snarled one night, slamming a beer bottle down. "We can't let her erase us like this."
Daniel muttered, "She didn't erase us.
We did that ourselves."
But Adrian wasn't listening.
His eyes burned with a dangerous determination.
Margaret sensed the storm brewing.
At a private dinner with donors, she confided in Victor and Claire, her niece who now managed much of the Foundation's operations.
They won't stop at words, Margaret said softly. I can feel it.
Adrian's pride won't let him fade quietly.
Daniel. I don't know what he'll do. But Oliver's caught in the middle. We need to protect him. Victor nodded gravely.
Then we put safeguards in place. Financial, legal, even personal security if we must.
The Foundation is strong, but you, Margaret, are still their symbol.
They'll come for you first.
That night, Margaret sat by her window, looking out over the city lights.
The weight of her journey pressed down. The humiliation, the slap, the betrayal, and the transformation that followed. She whispered into the night, almost to herself, "You wanted me weak. You wanted me gone. Instead, I became a movement. And this time, I won't stop until every last shadow is dragged into the light." Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 12, Margaret's enemies strike back, launching a smear campaign that threatens to undo everything she's built. But what they don't know is that Margaret is prepared for war. When the powerful can't silence you with fear, they come for your reputation. For Margaret Lawson, revenge had shifted from a wedding hall to the national stage, but her enemies weren't finished. They couldn't destroy her fortune, they couldn't stop her foundation, but if they could twist her image, turn her from symbol to villain, they might win back the control she had stolen.
The war was about to go public.
The first attack arrived quietly, tucked inside a late-night broadcast on a little-watched cable channel. A commentator leaned forward and asked,
"Can we really trust Margaret Lawson?
She claims to be an advocate for seniors, but insiders say she's a manipulative millionaire who abandoned her own son." Clips rolled across the screen. Shaky footage of Margaret confronting Daniel at a courthouse, her expression stern, his tearful. The narrator's voice dripped with insinuation. "She preaches protection for the vulnerable," the segment sneered, "yet she cut off her own flesh and blood. Is Margaret Lawson truly the hero America thinks she is, or just another cold opportunist exploiting a personal feud for fame?"
It was the beginning of a smear campaign. Within days, online blogs amplified the message.
Anonymous accounts flooded comment sections with claims that Margaret was mentally unstable, unfit to run a foundation, even dangerous to Oliver.
She slapped her son in public.
She's hiding dementia. She's just bitter her son married someone she didn't approve of.
None of it was true, but truth mattered less than noise.
Victor Cruz rushed into Margaret's office one morning, phone in hand. "They are saturating the feeds," he said, his voice tense. "Clips of Daniel crying, doctored quotes, even fake medical files. They are trying to bury you in scandal."
Margaret didn't flinch. "Who's behind it?" "Likely a coalition," Victor replied.
"Guardianship lobbyists, nursing home chains, maybe even Adrian himself. They all have a motive to see you discredited. And they've hired professionals, PR firms, shadow networks. This isn't amateur work." Claire, her niece, slammed her notebook shut. "Then we fight fire with fire. We release the full videos, the court records, every receipt that proves the truth."
Margaret nodded, but not in anger.
"We don't scream.
We don't beg. We expose. Calmly. Precisely.
The way I did at the wedding." The Foundation hired digital investigators. Within days, they traced several smear accounts back to shell companies tied to Adrian's former business partner and a lobbying firm notorious for corporate attacks. Margaret convened her board in a tense evening meeting. "They think they can rewrite my story," she told them.
"But my story is already out there. Millions watched it unfold.
What we do now is bigger than me. If they can do this to me, they can do it to any survivor who dares to speak up."
Victor leaned forward.
"So what's the plan?"
Margaret's eyes glinted.
"We turn their smear into proof. Proof that the predators aren't just in families, they are in boardrooms, law firms, and lobbying halls.
Let them show their teeth.
We'll show the world who they really are."
The counterattack launched with surgical precision.
Margaret appeared on 60 Minutes, not as a victim but as a fighter. Sitting across from the interviewer, she spoke plainly.
"They called me senile. They said I was unfit.
These aren't just lies about me, they are lies used against thousands of seniors every year. Families are tricked, silenced, gaslit into handing over everything they worked for.
My son and his husband tried it. Now powerful interests are trying it.
But we're not afraid anymore." Clips of Adrian surfaced next, captured from court records, him mocking Margaret in text messages, him laughing about snatching her keys, him boasting to Daniel about how easy it would be to declare her incompetent. The public backlash was swift. Margaret supporters rallied online under the hashtag #StandWithMargaret. Thousands of cines posted their own stories, sharing how relatives or corporations tried to steal their assets. Journalists dug into the lobbyists fueling the smear, uncovering conflicts of interest and shady donations. Suddenly, the smear campaign had boomeranged. Instead of destroying Margaret, it amplified her cause. But Adrian refused to back down. From his dingy apartment, he ranted on live streams, portraying himself as the true victim. "She abandoned her own son," he shouted. "She's manipulating all of you. Don't you see she's dangerous?" But his desperation only exposed his downfall. Viewers mocked his bitterness, contrasting his words with Oliver's quiet testimony at Foundation events. The more Adrian yelled, the smaller he became. Daniel, however, was silent. Margaret heard nothing from him, not a statement, not a call. In her heart, she wondered if he was trapped between regret and loyalty to Adrian. She didn't know which way he would break, and the uncertainty weighed on her. Late one night, she told Victor, "Adrian's hatred is obvious. But Daniel's silence, that's worse. Silence means maybe he's still plotting. Or maybe he's broken beyond repair." Victor put a hand on her shoulder. "You can't save someone who doesn't want saving, Margaret. But you can protect Oliver. Focus on that." The smear campaign collapsed within 3 months, buried under lawsuits and counter-investigations. Adrian's allies abandoned him, unwilling to be dragged into the light. The Elder Justice and Protection Act gained even more momentum, its hearings packed with victims emboldened by Margaret's story. But Margaret knew the fight wasn't over. The smear had failed, but it revealed something deeper. Her enemies were willing to escalate. And if they couldn't destroy her in the court of public opinion, they might try something far more dangerous. She stood in her office, gazing at a photo of Oliver smiling in her garden, and whispered, "They want war? Then war is what they'll get." Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 13, Adrian's bitterness turns into a reckless plan. He's no longer just trying to smear Margaret, he's preparing to strike at her life in a way no one expects. When hatred festers long enough, it turns into desperation, and desperation makes men reckless. Adrian Clark had lost his money, his marriage, and his reputation. Margaret Lawson's rise was his downfall, and every headline that praised her felt like a knife twisting deeper. But now, Adrian was done ranting on live streams. He wanted something darker. Something final. Adrian sat in his one-bedroom apartment, the glow of a muted television flickering across the empty beer bottles scattered on the floor. His face, once smug and polished, was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. On the screen, Margaret's face appeared again, this time on a segment about the Elder Justice and Protection Act passing its first major vote in Congress. She looked calm, dignified, untouchable. Adrian hurled the remote at the screen, the plastic shattering against the wall. "She ruined me," he spat. "She made me a joke." Beside him, a half-empty bottle of whiskey trembled in his grip. Daniel, who had been crashing on Adrian's couch for weeks, shifted uneasily. "Adrian, enough," he muttered. "You've got to stop obsessing. She's not worth it." "Not worth it?" Adrian's voice cracked into a bitter laugh. "She destroyed everything. Our credit, our future, our name. And you just sit there? She cut you off. She disinherited you. She turned your own son against you." Daniel flinched at the mention of Oliver. "Don't bring him into this." Adrian leaned closer, his eyes wild. "She already did. She poisoned him against us. He worships her now. Don't you get it? She wins as long as she's breathing." Daniel's stomach twisted. He knew that look in Adrian's eyes, dark, volatile, dangerous. "What are you saying?" Daniel asked carefully. Adrian whispered, almost gleeful, "I'm saying we finish this. Permanently." Daniel recoiled. "You can't be serious." Adrian stood, pacing like a man possessed. "Why not? We've lost everything. She walks around like some saint while we rot. One slap, and she destroyed us. I'll give her one back. A final one." Daniel's voice shook. "That's murder." "That's justice," Adrian snapped. Meanwhile, Margaret felt the unease tightening around her. Victor had hired additional security after the smear campaign, discreet men in suits who shadowed her at public events. Margaret resisted at first. She wasn't used to living like a guarded politician. But after receiving 3 anonymous letters with threats scribbled in jagged handwriting, she relented. Adrian's unraveling, Victor warned her one afternoon as they walked the garden paths outside her apartment.
The smear didn't work. His cornered. And cornered men lash out.
Margaret inhaled the crisp autumn air, her eyes scanning the horizon.
Let him come, she said softly. I won't live in fear. Not anymore. Victor frowned. Courage is one thing.
Foolishness is another. Adrian's desperation only grew. Late at night, he scoured forums for ways to silence someone without leaving a trace. He scribbled plans in notebooks, addresses, routines, vulnerabilities. He even tracked Oliver's school, though he stopped short of writing the boy's name, as though some last shred of morality kept him from crossing that line. Daniel watched in horror as Adrian spiraled deeper, but he lacked the strength to intervene. He felt trapped, ashamed to join Adrian's madness, but too broken to walk away. The turning point came when Adrian pawned his wedding ring for cash to buy a gun. Daniel found the receipt on the table. His hands shook as he confronted him. You're going to kill her.
Adrian smirked. Not kill. Erase. You don't kill a queen, you topple her.
And once she's gone, the foundation collapses, the bill dies, and Oliver comes back to you.
Daniel's voice broke. That's not how it works.
You think Oliver will forgive us if you hurt her? You think the world will forget what you've done?
Adrian's jaw clenched. I don't care about the world. I care about revenge.
Margaret, unaware of the gun now hidden in Adrian's closet, prepared for another public event, a fundraising gala in New York. Oliver would be speaking again, his young voice inspiring crowds far older than him.
The thought warmed her heart, but Victor's warnings lingered. Be vigilant, he had said. This isn't over.
That night, as she rehearsed her remarks, Margaret's phone buzzed.
An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A strained voice whispered on the other end.
Mom, it's me.
Daniel. Her chest tightened.
She hadn't heard his voice in months.
Daniel, she breathed.
Why are you calling?
A pause. His words cracked with fear. He's planning something. Adrian.
He's going to hurt you.
Margaret's blood ran cold.
Victor sprang into action, alerting law enforcement and tightening security. For the first time, Margaret admitted the truth. Adrian wasn't just bitter.
He was dangerous.
She stared at her reflection in the mirror, remembering the slap at the wedding, the humiliation that had started it all.
But this wasn't about dignity anymore. This was survival. Across town, Adrian loaded the gun. His eyes gleamed with a mad certainty. Tonight, he murmured.
Tonight she pays. Daniel sat in the corner, trembling, knowing that one wrong move could make him either an accomplice or a savior.
The clock ticked toward the gala. Margaret was walking into danger, unaware of just how close Adrian was.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 14, Adrian makes his move at the gala. But what happens next shocks everyone, and turns Margaret's revenge into something far more brutal than anyone imagined. Every revenge story builds toward a moment of reckoning. For Adrian Clarke, that moment was tonight, a glittering gala where he planned to end Margaret Lawson's life. For Margaret, it was the night her past and present collided in a storm of betrayal, desperation, and blood. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and the hum of polite conversation. Guests in gowns and tuxedos clinked glasses, oblivious to the shadow moving among them. Margaret Lawson stood at the center of it all, radiant in a navy gown, her smile calm though her heart felt heavy. Beside her, Oliver shuffled the speech cards nervously. He was the evening's highlight, Margaret's proudest achievement and proof of resilience.
Are you ready, darling? Margaret whispered, smoothing his tie. Oliver nodded. I just hope I don't mess it up. You won't, she assured him. You'll speak from the heart.
That's what matters. Across the ballroom, unseen, Adrian watched. His tuxedo had been borrowed, his entry secured with a forged invitation. He blended in well enough, but his eyes burned with hatred. In his pocket, the cold weight of the gun anchored him. Every time Margaret smiled, he tightened his grip, imagining the moment her smile would vanish forever. Daniel trailed behind, a reluctant shadow. He hadn't been able to stop Adrian, but he couldn't abandon him either. His stomach churned with dread as he scanned the security guards, wondering how long before everything unraveled.
Victor leaned close to Margaret as the evening progressed. Security's tight. We have eyes at every exit.
But stay sharp.
Margaret nodded, though she resisted glancing over her shoulder. She refused to let fear taint Oliver's moment.
At last, the host called Oliver to the stage. The boy stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nerves.
Good evening, everyone.
My name is Oliver, and tonight I want to talk about why protecting our elders matters. Not just in law, but in love.
Applause filled the room. Margaret's chest swelled with pride.
She had no idea that, in the shadows, Adrian's hand was sliding toward the pistol inside his jacket.
Daniel saw it. His breath hitched.
Adrian, don't.
Shut up, Adrian hissed. His eyes were locked on Margaret.
This is it. She dies, and we get our lives back. You'll destroy us both, Daniel pleaded, panic rising. Adrian ignored him. Oliver's words echoed across the hall. We must never let hatred define us. We must be better. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. His son spoke of forgiveness while his father prepared for murder. Adrian slipped the gun free, his movements masked by applause. He raised it, the barrel steady, his finger brushing the trigger. But before he could fire, Daniel lunged. The two men grappled, their struggle hidden by the crowd's cheers. Adrian snarled, forcing Daniel back, but Daniel clutched at his brother's arm with desperate strength.
The gun discharged. Bang! Screams erupted. Guests ducked, champagne flute shattered. Security rushed toward the chaos.
On stage, Oliver froze mid-sentence, staring in horror. Margaret's heart lurched as she scanned for the source of the shot. The bullet had missed her, splintering the edge of the podium instead. But Adrian, enraged, wrenched free of Daniel's grip and raised the weapon again. Adrian, stop.
Margaret's voice cut through the panic.
The crowd scattered around her, but she stood her ground, her eyes locked on the broken man who had once been her husband. Adrian's hands trembled, the gun still aimed at her.
You ruined me, he shouted, spittle flying.
You made me nothing. Margaret stepped forward, calm despite the danger.
No, Adrian.
You did that yourself. Security closed in, but Adrian kept the gun trained on Margaret. Daniel, chest heaving, shouted, Adrian, please.
Don't do this.
Think of Oliver. For the first time, Adrian's eyes flickered toward his son on the stage. Oliver's small, frightened figure seemed to freeze him.
Margaret seized the moment.
Her voice softened, cutting through the noise.
Look at him, Adrian. Is this what you want your son to remember?
That his father chose hate over him.
Adrian's arm wavered.
The gun shook. For a brief second, it seemed he might surrender. But then his face hardened again, madness eclipsing hesitation.
No, he growled.
She dies tonight.
He raised the gun higher.
Victor lunged from the side, slamming into Adrian just as the weapon fired a second time.
Bang!
The shot echoed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret's ears rang as she tried to register what had happened. When the smoke cleared, Adrian was pinned to the floor by two guards, the gun wrenched from his grasp. He thrashed and cursed, spitting venom at Margaret as they restrained him.
But her eyes weren't on Adrian. They were on Oliver.
Her son stood pale and trembling, his gaze fixed on the stage floor where something dark stained the polished wood.
Someone had been hit.
A woman screamed. Guests surged forward, confusion erupting into chaos.
Margaret's breath caught as she realized the truth.
The bullet had found its mark. Someone had fallen. But in the frenzy, she couldn't see who. Her heart pounded as she pushed through the crowd, calling Oliver's name, praying he was safe. Adrian laughed, a broken, guttural sound. You thought you won, Margaret?
You thought you were untouchable? Look around you.
Blood always answers blood. Margaret's hands trembled. This wasn't over. The shot hadn't been meant for Oliver, but the wound it left in the room was enough to fracture everything she'd fought to build. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. In Chapter 15, we'll see the aftermath of the gala confrontation. Who was hit by the bullet, and how will Margaret's revenge finally reach its brutal conclusion?
Revenge stories rarely end clean.
They leave scars, blood, and silence in their wake. At the gala, Margaret Lawson had stood tall against her enemies, but the final gunshot changed everything.
Tonight, the cost of vengeance would be counted in lives. The ballroom was chaos.
Screams echoed, chairs toppled, glass crunched beneath fleeing feet. Security pinned Adrian Clark to the ground as he laughed, spittle on his lips, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade.
You can't escape it, Margaret.
Blood for blood. Margaret pushed past panicked guests, her eyes fixed on the stage. Oliver was safe, shaken, pale, but unharmed.
Relief nearly buckled her knees. But then she saw it.
Victor Cruz lay on the floor, clutching his side where crimson spread across his white shirt. His face was gray, his breath shallow. He had thrown himself into Adrian's path, shielding her from the bullet. No,
Margaret gasped, kneeling at his side.
Stay with me, Victor.
Please.
Victor's hand found hers, weak but firm.
It had to be me, he rasped. You're the future, Margaret. Not him. You.
Paramedics shoved through the crowd, lifting Victor onto a stretcher. His blood stained Margaret's gown, his eyes closing as he was rushed away. For the first time since her humiliation at the wedding, Margaret felt true fear. Revenge had been her weapon, but now it threatened to take from her the one ally who had stood by her through every storm. Adrian was dragged away in handcuffs, still snarling curses. Daniel followed silently, his face hollow, as though the fight had drained the last of his spirit. The gala had ended not in triumph, but in terror. Cameras flashed, reporters screamed questions, and Margaret found herself in the center of a whirlwind she could no longer control. The next morning, headlines blared. Elder Justice Gala erupts in violence, gunman arrested. Victor Cruz critically wounded in attempted assassination of Margaret Lawson. Adrian Clark charged with attempted murder. Margaret sat in a hospital waiting room, her hands clasped, her gown replaced with a plain coat. Hours dragged by until a doctor emerged.
He's alive, the doctor said. Relief surged through her.
The bullet missed his heart, but the damage is serious. He'll need time, and you'll need patience.
Tears stung Margaret's eyes.
For once, they weren't tears of rage or humiliation, but gratitude. Adrian's trial began weeks later. The footage from the gala left no room for doubt. He had come to kill. His prior charges for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy were now overshadowed by attempted murder.
The judge's gavel struck hard.
Adrian Clark, you are sentenced to 30 years in state prison. Adrian shouted across the courtroom, his eyes wild. You think this is over, Margaret?
You'll never win.
You'll die alone.
Margaret met his gaze with calm defiance. I've already won, Adrian. You just don't see it yet.
Daniel sat 2 rows back, his head in his hands. He had avoided prison only by testifying against Adrian, but his shame was punishment enough. When he tried to approach her afterward, Margaret turned away.
She had made her choice.
Her revenge was complete, and there was no space in her life for a son who had betrayed her silence for greed.
Victor recovered slowly.
When he was finally released from a hospital, Margaret visited him daily, bringing books, flowers, and quiet companionship. Their bond deepened, forged in fire and blood. You could have let me die, Victor said once, his voice hoarse.
And you could have let me fall alone, Margaret replied softly. But you didn't.
That's why we're both still here. Months later, the Lawson Foundation expanded nationwide, aided by an outpouring of donations after the gala attack. Margaret became a symbol not just of survival, but of strength. Her story appeared on magazine covers, documentaries, and talk shows.
Yet fame was never her goal.
Her true satisfaction came in watching Oliver thrive, confident, compassionate, and free of the shadows that had consumed his father. She placed a hand on his shoulder one evening as he studied for school. You'll be better than all of us, she told him. You'll carry the good, not the hate. Oliver looked up at her, his eyes steady. That's because of you, Grandma. But revenge still whispered at night. Margaret often sat in her garden, staring at the stars, remembering the sting of Adrian's slap, the silence of Daniel's betrayal, the blood on Victor's shirt. Justice had been served, but wounds remained. One evening, Victor joined her. You've built something remarkable, he said. Do you ever regret it? Choosing revenge. Margaret considered his words. At last, she answered. Regret?
No. It was never about destroying them. It was about reclaiming me.
They tried to make me small, invisible, weak.
Now, I am none of those things.
That's my justice. Victor nodded, slipping his hand into hers. In that quiet moment, Margaret realized her revenge had transformed into something greater. Not just survival, not just punishment, but legacy. Adrian rotted behind bars, his name a curse. Daniel drifted aimlessly, his reputation ruined, his family ties severed.
Margaret never spoke to him again.
But Oliver grew strong, inheriting not wealth but wisdom. The Lawson Foundation flourished, protecting thousands of seniors from the cruelty Margaret had endured. And Margaret Lawson herself lived out her days not as a victim, nor merely as a survivor, but as a force, a woman who turned humiliation into fire, and fire into justice. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. Thank you for joining Margaret Lawson's journey of humiliation, defiance, and ultimate revenge. Sometimes love demands forgiveness, but sometimes it demands fire.